Can you tell me the history and the influence of Islam on the Moorish temple, Nation of Islam, and Five Percenters? Let's start with the Moorish temple.
Okay, so when it comes to the Moorish Science Temple, Five Percenters, and Nation of Islam, many of these movements is interesting because the Islam that they're practicing is completely different in a lot of theological concepts and in a lot of historical concepts to the Islam that is practiced in West Africa, which is similar as well to the Islam that's practiced in the Arabian Peninsula and most of the Muslim world. And so the origins and the history of these movements is something that's really interesting, and a lot of people don't make the connection that it goes back to Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was one of the predecessors of Marcus Garvey. And he was one of the first people he was an enslaved African man who who was given his freedom. And when he was freed, he returned to Africa to live in Africa. So there was this whole project going on with the two countries of Liberia and Sierra Leone. Liberia was a project that was meant to house liberated Africans from the Americas who wanted to return to Africa after the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So we saw many people from the Caribbean, many people from America returning to Africa, settling in Liberia and then settling in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown, was called Freetown because it was set up by the British to be a town for freed Africans or freed black people who wanted to return to Africa or who were actually liberated and were caught. You know, there was still illegal slaving going on, and so they were captured and liberated and then sent to Freetown. And so my ancestors on my mother's side, part of them are Wolof, Senegalese, and then the other part of them are freed, liberated Africans from Sierra Leone, who before that came from Nigeria and Ghana and other places. When he returned to Africa, he studied West African society, and he was a Christian, and he had come to Christianity through his time being enslaved, etc., in the West. And when he returned to Africa, he was still an ardent Christian, but he studied West African society, and he realized that the two predominant religions in West Africa were, number one, Islam, and number two, traditional African religions. And so he wrote a book called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. And in that book, he put forward the theory. Number one, he discussed the history of how Islam entered into Africa in comparison to how Christianity entered into Africa, West Africa specifically, because East Africa is a different story when it comes to Christianity, but in the West African context. And then he also discussed the influence that these religions had had in society, the positives and the negatives. And his conclusion was that Islam came in to West Africa positively, and it had a positive impact on West African people. And so through that, when people started to read his books and have access after slavery had ended and in the beginning of the 1900s, they started to look towards Islam as a solution to the problems that black people were facing in America. And so that's when we start to see the beginning of certain movements like the Moorish Science Temple, like the Nation of Islam, who are trying to connect with Islam. But if we look at the theology and the teachings of these movements, they weren't the same Islam that was being practiced in Africa. And so there was some kind of, there was some kind of lack of information or lack of access due to language barriers and due to cultural barriers and due to travel barriers, economic barriers that didn't allow that people from the African diaspora in the Americas to be able to connect with the African Islam that was being practiced by their ancestors. And this was the Islam that we see amongst enslaved populations in the Americas, but it faded out. So we have historical figures such as Kunta Kinte #1, who was one of the most famous people when it comes to the history of the transatlantic slave trade because of how his story was documented by his descendant, Alex Haley, who's the author of the autobiography of Malcolm X. But other more historical figures, because people doubt Kunta Kinte's people doubt if he was a real person. Some people have casted doubt on him that if he was a real person or not. I'm of the opinion that he was, but I know some people do doubt that. But if we look at characters such as Ayuba Suleiman Jallo, if we look at characters such as Omar bin Said, if we look at characters such as Yaro Mahmoud, and Yaro Mahmoud is very interesting because just last week I was in Georgetown University. I was invited to give a lecture there. And when I came to Georgetown University, they have the first on-campus mosque. And the mosque was named after a man called Yaro Mahmud. And he had a very, very interesting story. So he was a West African man, a Muslim, who was captured in the coasts of Guinea and transported to America. He eventually settled in Georgetown, which is Washington, D.C. And he made a deal with his master that anything he did in terms of daytime labor, they owned it, but anything he did in terms of nighttime labor, he had ownership of that. So he learned how to be a brick maker. He learned how to be a basket weaver. He learned about 5 different skills, and he would work at night and save money, to the point that when his master passed away, he was able to buy himself and his son freedom. And then he purchased his own property in Washington, D.C., and this is in the 1700s. He became one of the first African-American homeowners in America. He became one of the first African-American investors. He had his own businesses. He used to even lend money to white traders to trade. And then he became an investor in one of the first ever banks in Washington, D.C. And then he died on his own property and was buried on his own property. And he practiced Islam the entirety of his life. He used to pray 5 times a day. He was buried facing Mecca. And he's a historical figure. The same way we have Ayuba Suleiman Jallo, the fortunate slave, and we have Omar bin Said, whose documents, when I gave a lecture at Yale University, there was an exhibition of his diary and of his writings in the Yale Library. And this was a West African man who was captured, sold into slavery, and he used to write fluent Arabic, and he would read and write, and he would quote from the Quran, and he would quote from all of these different texts, and he would keep a diary of his life and his experiences. And all of these documents have been preserved I saw them in the Yale Library. And so this shows you then that Islam was very, very widely practiced in West Africa, and these people who were taken to the Americas were practicing Islam in the same way that they had left behind in West Africa. But amongst the movements that came in the 1920s that were trying to reconnect to Islam, because of that disconnect, we can see that the Islam being practiced by them and the Islam being practiced by their ancestors is completely different.